The paper in Martha Bell's hand trembled so violently that the ink seemed to blur and swim before her eyes, the words reshaping themselves into something monstrous, something final. 48 hours. That was all Harlan Decker's attorney had given her. 48 hours to produce $312 in back payments on the loan her late husband Thomas had taken against the Bell farm, or the land, the cattle, the house where she had buried 2 children and raised 1, where her calloused hands had learned the language of earth and season, where every fence post held a memory she could not name without weeping. Every single inch of it would pass into the ownership of Harlan Decker, the most powerful and most quietly ruthless man in Colby County. "Texas, you read it twice," said the attorney, a thin man named Pierce who wore his discomfort like an ill-fitting suit. "There is no ambiguity, Mrs. Bell." "There is no justice in it either," she said, and her voice did not break, though she had spent all her breaking the night before alone in the dark kitchen, face pressed to the table where Thomas used to read his Bible. She walked out of Pierce's office on the main street of Caldwell, Texas, into the glaring June sun of 1882, and she stood on the boardwalk with the legal notice folded in her fist, and the whole wide, merciless sky pressing down on her shoulders like a physical weight. People moved around her on the street, cowboys heading to the saloon, a woman shaking a rug from a second-floor window, a merchant stacking feed sacks outside his store. Nobody stopped. Nobody saw that the world had just cracked clean in two. She had one chance. One. She had been turning it over in her mind for days, ever since she first understood the true depth of the debt Thomas had hidden from her, the debt he had taken in a moment of desperation 2 years before a fever took him from this earth in November of 1881. The wheat crop. If she could harvest the spring wheat still standing in the east field, still green gold and heavy-headed despite the brutal summer heat, and if she could get it to the grain merchant in Caldwell before the 48-hour window closed, she might have enough. Might. The word was a razor's edge, and she was already bleeding. But the east field was 60 acres of wheat that needed harvesting, bundling, and hauling all within 2 days, and she had no hired hands, no money to pay for any, and her son Danny was 14 years old and strong as wire but not strong enough for this alone. She had priced the cost of a harvesting crew in town that morning. $12 a day per man, and she would need at least 8 men working without stop. She had $11.40 to her name. $312. The number had the weight of a tombstone. Martha Bell walked to where her horse, a dun mare named Sable, stood hitched outside the feed store, and she put her forehead against the horse's warm neck and closed her eyes and breathed. She was 31 years old, and she felt 100. She was also, underneath the grief and the exhaustion and the fear, still the same woman who had crossed 3 states in a covered wagon at the age of 19 to build something on this land, and that woman was not finished yet. She mounted Sable and turned south out of Caldwell, and the road home ran past the Crawford ranch. Joseph Crawford was not a man she knew well, despite living less than 2 miles from his property line for nearly 11 years. He was her neighbor in the way that all neighbors are in wide country, someone whose lamp she could see from her porch on clear nights, someone she nodded to at church on the Sundays he attended, someone whose reputation had preceded him even before she understood anything about his character. He was 35 years old, never married, had come to Colby County from somewhere in Tennessee about 6 years back, and had built his operation from raw land into one of the finest cattle spreads in the region. People said he was fair, honest, and private to the point of mystery. People also said he had a dark past tied to the war, to something that happened at a place nobody named directly, the way you don't name a wound you are still carrying. Thomas had never liked him, though Martha had never understood why. Thomas was a man who made his judgments early and defended them with the rigidity of someone afraid of being wrong. He had said Crawford was the kind of man who offered a hand only when he needed something in return, and Martha had filed that away without examining it too closely, because Thomas was her husband and she had trusted him, even when she should not have trusted everything he said. Now Thomas was 7 months in the ground, and Martha was riding past the Crawford ranch with a foreclosure notice in her coat pocket and 60 acres of uncut wheat standing between her and ruin. She almost did not stop. She told herself afterward that she had been going to ride straight home and spend the rest of the day calculating some other impossible solution. But Sable shied at something in the ditch beside the road, a coiled snake that turned out to be a fallen branch, and in the moment that Martha pulled the horse around and steadied herself, she looked up and saw Joseph Crawford standing at the fence line of his south pasture watching her. He was taller than she remembered, brown hair going gray at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same cedar posts he built his fences with. He was wearing a work shirt rolled to the elbows, and he had the hands of a man who did not stand back from labor. He was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately name, something between concern and restraint, as though he had been about to speak for some time and kept talking himself out of it. "Mrs. Bell," he said. "Mr. Crawford," she said. There was a silence in which the grasshoppers sang and a hawk turned a lazy circle overhead, and the enormity of what she was about to ask settled onto her like a second skin, tight and suffocating. "You look like a woman with a problem," he said. Not unkindly. "I look like a woman whose husband left her a secret debt, and whose wheat needs to be off the field in 48 hours or Harlan Decker takes her land," she said, because there was no graceful way to say it and she had long since used up her patience for pretending. Something shifted in Joseph Crawford's face. The restraint cracked slightly, and underneath it she saw something sharp and immediate, not pity. She could not have borne pity, but something more like recognition. Like a man who has seen this kind of trap before and knows exactly who set it. "Decker," he said, and the single word had the flavor of vinegar. "His attorney served me this morning." She pulled the notice from her pocket and held it out across the fence without dismounting, and he took it with steady hands and read it with the focused quiet of a man who understood legal language. She watched his jaw tighten. Once then again, he handed it back. "How much of the wheat is ready?" he asked. 60 acres in the east field, heavy-headed, good yield if I can get it down. Equipment: 1 reaper that needs the blade sharpened, 2 wagons, Danny and myself." Joseph Crawford looked out across his own land for a moment, past the grazing cattle and the summer-dry grass, into some middle distance where he appeared to be calculating something that went beyond wheat and acreage. Then he looked back at her and she felt the weight of his gaze the way you feel the sun shifting, something full and direct and warmer than expected. "I'll bring 4 men and my draft horses," he said. "We start at first light." Martha Bell had been braced for so many things, for refusal, for conditions she could not meet, for the quiet cruelty of being told she should have known better or married better or been born to a different life. She had not been braced for this. "I cannot pay you," she said. The words came out rougher than she intended, because she needed him to understand that she was not asking for charity wrapped in neighborly niceness. "Not until I sell the wheat. Maybe not at all if the yield falls short." "I know that," he said. "Then why?" she asked. He was quiet for a beat longer than felt comfortable. "Because Harlan Decker has been picking apart this county for a decade and nobody has made him answer for it," he said. "And because your field is 60 acres and 48 hours and that's a problem I can help solve." He paused. "And because you asked." She had not technically asked. She had told him the problem, and he had stepped into the space where the question would have been. She noticed that. She filed it away the same way she filed away all the things about this man she did not yet understand. "First light," she said. "First light," he agreed. She rode home with the foreclosure notice still in her pocket and something new sitting alongside it. Not hope exactly. Hope was too light a word for what she felt. It was more like the particular steadiness that comes from having one solid plank to stand on when the rest of the floor has given way. The morning she spent in Thomas's debt arrived like a reckoning she had been delaying. After she got home from Caldwell, after she told Danny what was happening with the careful, factual honesty she had decided to use with him from the day Thomas died, After she fed the few remaining chickens and checked the water in the cistern, and sharpened the reaper blade by lamplight until her arms ached, she sat at the kitchen table and allowed herself to look fully at the shape of the life Thomas Bell had built and partly hidden from her. Thomas had been a good man in the ways that were easy to see. He had loved her in his limited way. He had worked hard. He had not drunk or gambled the way some men did. But he had carried a fear of failure so large and so private that it had made him do things alone that they should have done together, and the debt to Decker was the most terrible consequence of that fear. He had borrowed the money when the cattle prices dropped in 1879, borrowed against the land without telling her, convinced that one good year would let him pay it back before she ever needed to know. One good year had not come. Then the fever took him, and the truth came out in the paperwork, and Martha had been left holding a debt with no map of how it had gotten there. She had grieved Thomas deeply, with the full and complicated love of a woman who had built her life alongside a man's limitations as much as his strengths. But sitting alone with his papers in the lamplight, she also felt something she was not proud of, a dry and terrible anger at him for leaving her here without warning, without the chance to prepare, without even the dignity of knowing what she was inheriting. She let the anger burn for a few minutes and then she folded it away because anger would not cut wheat. Danny came to the kitchen door in his long nightshirt and asked if she needed anything. "Sleep," she told him. "We are going to need everything we have tomorrow." He nodded and went back to bed with the serious face of a boy who has grown up too fast, and Martha blew out the lamp and lay down in the dark and tried to rest. Joseph Crawford arrived at 40 minutes before dawn with 4 of his ranch hands, a team of 2 heavy draft horses, a sharpened second reaper blade, a water barrel, a lunch pail that turned out to contain enough food for 10 people, and a manner so unhurried and competent that it made the impossible task look merely difficult. His men were named Hector, a broad-shouldered Mexican vaquero of about 30 who had worked for Crawford for 4 years, and Pete, a wiry red-haired man of around 25 who moved constantly and laughed easily, and 2 brothers named Cal and Ned Briggs who were quiet and methodical and could have passed for each other in dim light. They greeted Martha with their hats off and their eyes respectful, and they greeted Danny with the easy directness of men used to treating young people like people. "He runs one of the wagons," Joseph Crawford said to Martha, nodding at Danny. "Good driver. Best I have," she said. "Then put him on the lead wagon. Pete will drive the second. You and I work the reaper." She looked at him. "You know how to run a reaper." "I know how to run most things," he said, and the ghost of something that was not quite a smile moved across his face so quickly she almost missed it. They started at first light, the way he had said. The east field opened before them in the low morning sun like a carpet of amber and gold, the wheat heads heavy and nodding in the small breeze that would burn away by 9 o'clock. The reaper moved through it in long, methodical passes, the mechanical rattle of the blades cutting through the silence of the early morning, and behind it the men worked in a rhythm that Joseph Crawford had clearly established before Martha was up, each man knowing his job without being told twice. Martha worked alongside them. She did not stand back and supervise from a distance. She had never been a woman who supervised from a distance. She bound sheaves with her own hands until her fingers cramped. She hauled bundles to the wagon with her back screaming. She handed water to the men without being asked, and kept the count on the loads going out to make sure nothing was being left too long in the field to heat in the growing sun. At some point in the mid-morning, when the heat had descended like a physical thing, and everybody was moving through it with the particular grim endurance of people who know they cannot stop, she found herself working beside Joseph Crawford at the reaper, feeding the wheat through the mechanism in the smooth, alternating rhythm they had developed over the past 3 hours, and she became aware for the first time of the quality of his silence. Most men, in Martha's experience, filled silence with noise, chatter, opinions, complaints, the small verbal flags of their presence. Joseph Crawford was quiet in the way that large, still bodies of water are quiet, not empty but deep, and working beside him had a strange, almost confusing effect on her because she felt both more alone and less alone than she had felt in months. "You knew about the debt before I told you," she said, not looking at him, keeping her eyes on the wheat and her hands on the mechanism. There was a pause. "I knew Decker had his eyes on your land," he said. "I didn't know the mechanism." "How long have you known?" "Long enough that I should have said something sooner," he said. "I didn't because it wasn't my business. And now it is." "Now you made it my business," he said, "by being on the road at the right time." She considered this. "What does Decker want with my land?" "Water rights. Your creek runs east-west across your southeast corner. His land is dry all summer except for one stock pond. He's been wanting that water access for years." Crawford was quiet for a moment. "He's gotten 3 other properties the same way. Lend money quiet, wait for a bad season, foreclose." Martha felt the familiar cold spread through her chest, the particular chill of understanding that you have been targeted, not just unfortunate. Thomas didn't know. "Thomas Bell was a proud man," Crawford said carefully. "I don't know what he knew. But Decker's terms were designed to be hard to meet." She stopped moving for just a moment, just one breath, and then she began again with the wheat. "Then we make sure I meet them," she said. "That's why we're here," he said. They worked through the noon hour without breaking, everyone eating standing up, bread and cold salt pork from the pail Crawford had brought, washed down with water that was already warm from the barrel. The field was coming down faster than Martha had dared calculate. She revised her numbers twice, standing in the shadow of a wagon wheel with a pencil stub in the back of an envelope, and what she found made her press her lips together in something that felt dangerous, something that felt like actual hope. "If the yield holds," she told Crawford, showing him the envelope, "and if Gunderson's price holds at 80 cents a bushel, we'll clear $370. He looked at the numbers. His expression gave nothing away, but she saw something in his eyes that she had not quite expected to see there, something quiet and invested, as though the outcome mattered to him in a way that extended beyond the practical. "Yield will hold," he said. "That's good wheat. Thomas planted it," she said, and was surprised by the tenderness that moved through her voice without her permission. Whatever else he got wrong, he knew wheat. Something gentled in Crawford's face at that. He did not say anything, but he handed the envelope back to her with something in the gesture that felt like acknowledgement, like he understood that she was carrying both grief and anger, and that neither one canceled the other out. The afternoon was brutal. The temperature climbed past anything comfortable and kept going, the kind of Texas June heat that sits on your chest and argues with your will. Hector got a cut from a blade corner that Martha cleaned and wrapped without fuss while he kept working. Cal Briggs went white around the mouth from the heat, and Martha made him sit in the wagon shade for 20 minutes drinking water while his brother covered his work. And when Cal came back, he was steady and grateful, and said nothing except "Thank you, ma'am," in a tone that meant a great deal more than the words. Danny drove the wagon with a concentration and steadiness that made Martha's throat tight with pride. He was Thomas's son in his jaw and his coloring, but he was her son in his spine and his refusal to quit, and watching him navigate the heavy wagon through the cut stubble with careful competence, she felt something that lived alongside grief and was not its opposite, something more like continuity. By late afternoon they had cut 41 acres. Martha stood at the edge of what remained and calculated out loud, not to anyone in particular, just to the air. 19 acres still standing. "At this rate we finish by mid-morning tomorrow." "Earlier," Crawford said from behind her. "We'll work by lantern for another 2 hours tonight." She turned to look at him. He had his shirt sleeves rolled even higher now, both forearms brown and dusted with the pale chaff of cut wheat, and there was a long scratch along his left jaw from a broken stalk he had walked through without noticing. He looked tired the way working men look tired, not depleted but used, every bit of him present and accounted for. "You are going to work your men by lantern light after a full day already," she said. "My men are going to get a hot supper first," he said. "Can you cook?" "Better than this," she said, gesturing at the half-empty pail. "Then that's the deal," he said. supper, then 2 more hours by light. We finish tonight." She fed them all in her kitchen, which had not held so many people since Thomas's funeral. She made biscuits and beans and fried salt pork, and opened the last 3 jars of her preserved tomatoes from the fall, and she made coffee strong enough to hold a horseshoe upright. And the men ate at the table, and on the porch steps, and across the arms of chairs dragged outside. And the sound of their voices in the summer evening was so full and human that it put a small, sharp ache in the center of Martha's chest, the particular ache of recognizing something you have been missing for longer than you knew. Crawford ate his supper on the porch steps, his back against the post, and Danny sat beside him and talked about the farm with the careful seriousness of a boy who understood he was the man of this household now and wanted to be taken seriously. And Crawford listened to him with genuine attention, asking questions that showed he was actually hearing the answers, not just waiting for the boy to stop talking. Martha watched them through the kitchen window while she washed the plates, and she felt something move through her that was complicated and quiet, and that she was not yet prepared to name. They worked by lantern light until the moon was high, and then they worked by moonlight when the lanterns began to burn down, because the night was clear, and the moon was nearly full, and the field seemed to glow under it, the remaining wheat silver and ghost pale, and there was something about working in that light that felt outside ordinary time, outside the ordinary weight of things, as though the darkness had stripped away everything unnecessary and left only the work and the people doing it. Martha was bundling the last of the sheaves from the lantern section when she straightened up too fast, and the world tilted slightly, the long day catching up with her all at once, the particular vertigo of exhaustion. Crawford's hand was at her elbow before she had fully registered losing her balance. Not grabbing, just steadying, his palm warm against her arm through the fabric of her sleeve, and he held it there for only the moment it took her to right herself, and then he let go, but the impression of it stayed, the steady warmth of it, and she was annoyed with herself for noticing. "You should rest," he said. "I'll rest when it's done," she said. "Mrs. Bell." "Martha," she said, because it felt ridiculous in this field at this hour to be Mrs. Bell. "My name is Martha." A quiet moment in which the lantern light moved over his face and something in his expression shifted, opened slightly, like a door that has been stuck on a warped frame finally moving. "Martha," he said, and she had never heard her own name sound quite like that before, like something worth saying carefully. "Joseph," she said, and they looked at each other for a moment in the lantern light and the moonlight and the smell of cut wheat and summer dust, and then they both looked back at the field because there was still work left to do. They finished the last of the east field at 2 in the morning. All 60 acres cut, bundled, loaded onto the wagons in organized rows, ready to haul. The men celebrated the way working men celebrate, a brief and heartfelt profanity from Pete, a wide, quiet smile from Hector, the Briggs brothers shaking hands with each other as though sealing a deal. Danny let out a whoop that cracked slightly in the middle with adolescent energy, and then looked mortified. And Hector clapped him on the shoulder and told him in a mixture of Spanish and English that the whoop was earned, and he should not waste it on embarrassment. Martha stood at the edge of the finished field and looked at what they had done, and felt the kind of exhaustion that lives very close to joy. She turned to find Joseph Crawford standing a few feet behind her, watching her face, and she did not mind being watched in that particular moment, because there was nothing in his expression that required her to be anything other than what she was. "Thank you," she said. She put everything in it, everything she had no eloquent way to express, the scale of what he had given her without being asked, the dignity of how he had done it. "Get some sleep," he said gently. "I'll bring the wagons in at sunrise." She wanted to say more. There were things pressing against the inside of her chest that had no shape in words yet. She nodded instead and turned toward the house, and she was almost to the porch steps when she heard him say her name quietly just once. She turned. He was looking at her from across the stubbled field, the moonlight turning everything soft and silver around them. "You didn't break," he said. "I want you to know I saw that." She stood with that for a moment. Then she went inside. She did not sleep for a long time. She lay in the dark and thought about Thomas, about the farm, about Harlan Decker and his trap, about 60 acres of wheat now stacked and waiting. And she thought, carefully and honestly, and with the slight alarm of a woman who has not expected this, about Joseph Crawford standing in her east field at 2 in the morning saying she had not broken. Sunrise came hard, and early the way Texas June sunrises do, the sky going from black to deep purple to sudden brutal gold in the space of what felt like minutes. Martha was already up and dressed, and had the coffee on when she heard the wagon wheels in the yard. Joseph Crawford was driving the lead wagon himself. His men had gone back to his ranch for a few hours' sleep and would follow later. It was just him and his draft horses in the early gold light, and he came around the side of the house to the back porch and accepted the coffee she handed him without any ceremony, standing at the porch rail and looking out at the loaded wagons in the morning light. "Danny up?" he asked. "Dressing," she said. "He'll drive the second wagon." "Good." He drank the coffee in silence and she stood beside him, and the morning was very quiet and very large around them. And Martha felt again that complicated thing that she was working up the courage to name. Not yet, she told herself. Not until the wheat is sold and the debt is paid and you are standing on solid ground again. Not until you can be sure you are not just reaching for the nearest steady thing, because everything else has been so unsteady for so long. It was a reasonable caution, and she held to it. They drove into Caldwell with the 2 loaded wagons at 9 in the morning, and Lars Gunderson at the grain merchant's looked at the load with the practiced indifference of a man who does his excitement in private and his business in public, and he measured and weighed and calculated and wrote a number on a piece of paper and slid it across the counter to Martha. $348. Less than she had hoped, more than she needed. She stood at Lars Gunderson's counter and looked at that number and breathed slowly until the shaking in her hand stopped, and then she looked up at Joseph Crawford, who was standing at her shoulder, and she did not need to say anything because he could read her face clearly enough. "Enough?" he asked quietly. 312 needed, she said. "Yes." The relief on his face was so unguarded and so genuine that it cut through every careful distance she had been keeping. He had cared about this outcome with his whole self, not because of some hidden motive or secret arrangement, not because he needed something from her, but because he simply, uncomplicatedly, genuinely cared whether she won. And the full weight of that landed on Martha Bell in Lars Gunderson's grain merchant office like the gentlest possible collision, the kind that leaves you slightly stunned and entirely changed. She paid Pierce's office the $312 at 11 that morning, in cash, counting the bills onto the desk with the steady hands of a woman who has nothing left to prove. The thin attorney looked at the money with an expression that mixed professionalism and surprise, because Harlan Decker had apparently believed the payment impossible, and Decker did not enjoy being wrong about what was impossible. Martha received her receipt and walked out into the Caldwell noon with the farm still hers, and she stood on the boardwalk in the sun and thought about all the people who had told her, in the gentle and not so gentle ways people have, that a woman alone could not hold land in this territory, could not run a farm, could not outlast the combined weight of debt and drought and the patient predation of men like Decker. She thought about all of that, and she tucked the receipt very precisely into her coat pocket, and she breathed. Joseph Crawford was leaning against the hitching post outside, his hat pushed back, the June sun full on his face. "Done?" he asked. "Done," she said. "Good," he said. They stood there in the Caldwell noon for a moment, 2 people who had spent the last day and night doing an extraordinary thing together, standing in the ordinary daylight on the other side of it. "I owe you," she said. He shook his head. "I mean it," she said. "Not just the labor, the men, the horses, the equipment, your time, that's a real debt." "It isn't," he said. "Joseph." She said his name with the firmness of someone settling an argument. I don't take things without accounting for them. That's not how I was raised, and it's not who I am." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the street. Then he looked back at her, and there was something in his expression she had not seen there before, something tentative, something that sat differently on a man who was generally so direct. "Then have supper with me," he said. "Saturday evening. That's all I want." The simplicity of it took her sideways. She had been prepared to negotiate labor rates and deferred payment terms and the proper valuation of draft horsework. She had not been prepared for Saturday supper. "That's all," she said. "That's a start," he said, and this time the almost smile stayed on his face long enough for her to actually see it, and it was a good smile, the kind that changes a face entirely, the kind that suggests a great deal of warmth kept carefully in reserve. She said yes. The week between the wheat harvest and Saturday evening was the strangest week Martha Bell had experienced since the week after Thomas died, strange in the opposite direction, strange with a quality of aliveness she had almost forgotten. She worked hard, as she always did. She repaired the fence on the north pasture with Danny, reseeded the bare patch near the chicken coop, made her careful accounting of what the farm would need through the summer and fall to stay solvent. She did all of this with the same competence she brought to everything. But she also caught herself thinking about Joseph Crawford at odd moments, about his hands at the reaper, about the way he had spoken to Danny, serious and respectful, about what he had said at the edge of the moonlit field. She caught herself and examined the thoughts and did not entirely make them stop. On Thursday, she ran into Harlan Decker outside the dry goods store. He was a large man, Decker, not tall but wide through the shoulders, with a face that had the permanent redness of someone whose pleasantness is a performance they have been giving for so long they no longer notice the effort. He was about 50 years old, and he was wearing an expensive hat and the expression of a man who owns things. "Mrs. Bell," he said, with the particular warmth of someone who expected to own something of yours and doesn't. "Mr. Decker," she said. "I understand you made the payment to Pierce's office," he said. "I did," she said. "Remarkable," he said, and the word had edges to it. "The wheat cooperated," she said pleasantly. He looked at her for a moment with the expression behind the expression, the flat evaluating look that had nothing to do with good neighbors and everything to do with arithmetic. "I heard Crawford helped," he said. "Several people helped," she said. "Crawford especially," he said. "You know he has a personal reason to oppose me, Mrs. Bell. His involvement with your situation may not be as straightforward as it seems." Martha looked at Harlan Decker and felt the particular cold clarity of understanding a person's nature completely. "He worked my field for 2 days without pay," she said. "In my experience, that's about as straightforward as it gets." She went into the dry goods store and he did not follow her. But the word stayed with her, the way a splinter stays, small and irritating and refusing to be ignored. Crawford had a personal reason to oppose Decker. What did that mean? And did it change anything? She held the question up against everything she had observed about Joseph Crawford over the past days, every measured look, every quiet decision, every moment of genuine warmth and genuine competence. And she tried to find the hidden motive Decker had implied, the trap underneath the help. She could not find it, but the question had been planted, and she carried it with her to Saturday. He came to her door at 6 in the evening with his hat in his hand and a clean shirt, and the slightly formal bearing of a man who knows how to be comfortable in hard work, but is less certain about this other thing. She had made a proper supper. Roast chicken with the dried herbs from last summer's garden, cornbread, a jar of the preserved peaches Danny had half-jokingly suggested she open for a special occasion. Danny himself had been fed early and sent to spend the evening at his friend Tom Archer's house, with the careful discretion of a 14-year-old who understood more than his mother was entirely comfortable with. They ate at the kitchen table, the same table where she had spent so many nights with Thomas's papers and her own fears, and the room felt different with Joseph Crawford in it, not larger exactly but more occupied, more used in the way rooms are meant to be used. They talked easily, which surprised her less than the depth of it. He asked about the farm's history, and she told him honestly, including the parts that were hard, the droughts, the failed cattle venture of 1878, the way Thomas had managed things. He listened with the quality of attention she had noticed in the field, genuine and focused, and he asked questions that showed he was tracking not just the facts but the weight behind them. In return, she asked him about Tennessee, and he was quiet for a moment in the way she had come to understand meant he was deciding how much to give. "I came out here because Tennessee was finished for me," he said, "after the war." "You fought?" she asked. "I did," he said. He looked at the table briefly. "On the wrong side, by my own reckoning now. I was 17, and I did what the men around me told me was right, and I found out it wasn't." He said this with the flat directness of a man who has made his peace with something terrible by looking at it without flinching. "I can't take back what I did in those years. I can account for it with what I do afterward." Martha considered this. It was exactly the kind of dark past that Decker had implied was a hidden danger, and sitting here at her kitchen table, it was nothing of the kind. It was a man who had looked at the worst of himself and decided to build something different. "Decker told me you had a personal reason to oppose him," she said. She had decided to say it directly, because that was the only way she knew. Joseph Crawford's expression did not change dramatically, but she saw something move through it. "I do," he said. "One of the properties Decker foreclosed on 3 years ago was owned by a family named Santiago, Hector's family. His father and mother had worked that land for 20 years. Decker took it the same way he tried to take yours. Hector came to work for me because he had nowhere else to go." He paused. "Decker knows I know what he is. He's been waiting for me to make a move against him that he can answer." "And helping me wasn't that?" she asked. "Helping you was helping you," he said, and he said it with a quietness that settled the question completely. The fact that it also frustrated Decker is a separate satisfaction. Martha looked at him across the table and felt something unknot inside her chest that she had not realized was knotted. The caution she had been holding, the careful distance, the self-protective reserve she had wrapped around the thing she felt for this man. It had been loosening all week, and now she felt it give way entirely, not dramatically, not with any particular event, just the quiet collapse of a wall that had served its purpose and was no longer needed. She told him that. Not all of it, not in those exact terms, but enough. "I have been very careful," she said, "about what I think about you." He looked at her steadily. "And now?" he asked. "And now I am less careful," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, just that, his broad, warm hand over hers, and the simple human weight of it after 7 months of being entirely alone in her own skin made her breath go short in a way she could not have predicted and did not try to hide. They sat like that for a while, with the lamplight between them and the summer night outside the windows and everything that had happened in the past week still present in the room like a third and fourth presence, and it was very quiet and very full. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you'll allow it. I am 31 years old and I have a 14-year-old son and a farm debt I am still paying down," she said. "Properly might look different from what it looked like when either of us was younger. It can look however you need it to look," he said. "I'm not in a hurry. I'm not going anywhere." She turned her hand over under his and held it. "Then yes," she said. The summer that followed was the kind of summer that rearranges a life without announcing itself. Joseph Crawford came to the Bell farm 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes with a specific reason: helping Danny repair the leaning section of the barn roof, bringing over a calf he had noticed was too thin, helping Martha understand the county water rights documentation she had begun reading with new urgency after Decker's revelation. Sometimes without any specific reason at all, just riding over in the early evening and sitting on the porch with her while the light went gold and then purple and then dark, talking about nothing complicated or about everything complicated, depending on the evening. Danny watched all of this with the elaborate casualness of a boy trying very hard to pretend he was not watching. He had liked Joseph Crawford from the moment in the moonlit field when Crawford had told him his whoop was earned. He liked him more as the weeks went on, because Crawford treated him as a person whose opinions and observations about the farm were worth hearing, and because Crawford never once tried to step into the space where Thomas had been, never positioned himself as a replacement, only as something new and separate, which Danny, without ever saying so directly, clearly appreciated. Martha saw this and felt a gratitude she had not expected. In August, she told Joseph Crawford about the two children she had lost. The first had been a son, born in 1874 and gone within the week from a lung fever that left Martha with empty arms and a grief she had carried so quietly that even Thomas had not fully understood its dimensions. The second had been a daughter, stillborn in 1877, who Martha had held for 1 hour in a blue morning before the midwife took her away. She told him this on a hot August evening on the porch, not because she had planned to, but because they were talking about loss in the way people do when they trust each other, moving from the smaller losses toward the larger ones with the natural gravity of honesty. Crawford listened to all of it with the attention she had come to expect from him, and when she finished he was quiet for a long time and then he said, "I am sorry you carried that so much alone." It was exactly the right thing to say and she had not known she needed to hear it until she heard it. She asked him in the quiet after whether he had wanted children. He thought about it honestly. "Yes," he said. "I thought that life was not going to be available to me. I thought I had made choices early that made certain things impossible." He looked at his hands. "I stopped wanting things I couldn't see how to get." "And now?" she asked, and her voice was careful because the answer mattered. He looked at her in the August lamplight from the windows, and she watched the measured, private man she had come to know decide, visibly and deliberately, not to be measured or private about this. "Now I can see how to get them," he said. She kissed him that evening for the first time, standing at the porch rail in the hot dark, the way she did everything, directly and without apology, and he kissed her back with a thoroughness and a tenderness that told her everything she needed to know about the warmth he kept in reserve. In September, Harlan Decker made his next move. It came through his attorney Pierce, in the form of a legal challenge to the water rights on the Bell Farm Southeast Creek. Decker had apparently found an old survey error in the original land grant that placed the creek's boundary point 12 feet differently than the current fence line, and he was filing to have the water access rights re-examined on the grounds of the survey discrepancy. He was not going after the land this time. He was going after the water. Martha received the legal notice on a Tuesday morning and was at Joseph Crawford's ranch by noon. She found him in the yard working a young horse on a long line, and he stopped when he saw her face and handed the line to one of his hands and came to her directly. She gave him the document. He read it. "He's not done," she said. "No," Crawford agreed. "But this is weaker than the mortgage. He's reaching with a legal argument I can't answer without a lawyer, and lawyers cost money I don't have." Crawford was quiet for a moment, and she watched him thinking through something, the private internal calculation she had learned to recognize and wait for. "There's an attorney in San Antonio named Elias Ruiz," he said. "He's handled water rights cases for 3 ranches I know of. He's good and he's fair about fees." He looked at her. "I'll write to him today, and I'll provide an affidavit about the survey if it helps." "You know about the survey?" she asked. "I know your fence line is correct," he said. "I've seen the original markers. I'll testify to that." She looked at him, this man who had come into her crisis with everything he had and kept showing up, and she felt something so large and so clear that she wondered how she had ever managed to be careful about it. "Joseph," she said. "Martha," he said. "I love you," she said. She had not planned to say it here in his yard over a legal dispute, but there it was. The full and honest weight of it, standing in the September sun between them. Crawford went very still for a moment, not in surprise exactly, but in the way a person goes still when something they have been waiting for a long time finally arrives, and they are taking the measure of it. "I love you too," he said, and the simplicity of it, the directness of it, the complete absence of performance or qualification, was so entirely like everything she had come to know about this man that it made her laugh. A short, startled sound that had a great deal of relief and a great deal of joy in it. He took both her hands and held them, and they stood in his yard with the horse watching them from the end of the long line, and the September sun warm on the back of her neck, and she felt, for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, entirely whole. Elias Ruiz came to Caldwell in October. He was a compact, precise man of about 45 with reading glasses he wore on a cord, and a manner so systematic and thorough that Martha liked him immediately. He reviewed the survey documents, the original land grant, the fence markers, and a detailed affidavit from Joseph Crawford about the original boundary stones, which Crawford located and pointed out to Ruiz on a clear October morning, the two men walking the southeast boundary of the Bell farm with measuring ropes and considerable satisfaction. The hearing before the county judge was in November, a year almost to the day from Thomas Bell's death. Martha sat at the table in the small courthouse courtroom with Elias Ruiz on one side and Joseph Crawford 3 rows back in the gallery, and she presented herself with the calm she had discovered she possessed in abundance when the stakes were high enough. Decker's attorney argued the survey discrepancy with the practiced confidence of someone who had won by technical maneuver before. Ruiz argued the original boundary documentation and the affidavit evidence with a precision that was almost elegant. The judge, a deliberate man named Holloway who Martha had heard was honest and had no connection to Decker's interests, asked both parties a series of sharp questions that showed he had read everything thoroughly. He ruled for Martha Bell. The water rights were confirmed as established by the original land grant. The survey discrepancy was ruled a clerical error in the county records, not a property boundary issue. Decker's claim was dismissed. Martha walked out of that courthouse into the November cold and stood on the steps and breathed the cold air deeply and looked up at the winter sky, pale blue and enormous above the rooftops of Caldwell. Joseph Crawford came out behind her and she felt him before she saw him, the particular warmth of his presence beside her. "Over," he said. "For now," she said, because she was a practical woman and she knew that men like Decker did not give up easily. "For good," he said with a certainty she questioned. "How can you be sure?" "Because I intend to make sure," he said, and there was something in his tone that made her turn to look at him, something that had a larger purpose in it than she had heard before. "What does that mean?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, his breath making small clouds in the November air. "It means," he said carefully, "that a man who owns the adjoining property is a great deal harder for Decker to isolate and pick apart than a widow alone, legally and practically." He paused. "It means I have been thinking about asking you to marry me, and I have been trying to decide whether it was too soon and whether you would hear it as a practical proposal and misunderstand what it is." Martha looked at him for a long time. "What is it?" she asked. "It is a man who loves you and your son and your farm and your wheat and the way you stand at a fence line and refuse to break," he said. "It is everything practical as well, because love in this territory needs practical scaffolding to survive. But the practical scaffolding is not the reason." She was quiet for a moment that felt large and important. "I will not give up the Bell name on the farm," she said. "Thomas was not a perfect man, but he worked that land and my children are buried on it, and it is the Bell farm." "I would not ask you to," he said. "And Danny needs time to come to it in his own way," she said. "Of course," he said. "And I am a woman who will have opinions about how things are run, and I will not be quiet about them," she said. "Martha," he said, with the ghost of the smile she loved, "I have never once in my life wanted you to be quiet." She laughed again, the same startled, real, relieved laugh she had laughed in September, and then she said yes. They were married in the spring of 1883, on a Saturday in April when the land was green, and the air smelled of rain and new grass, and the particular clean hope of Texas in the turn toward warmth. The ceremony was in the small Methodist church in Caldwell, performed by the minister Reverend Blake, with Danny standing beside his mother in a new suit that was already slightly too small because he had grown again, and Hector and Pete and the Briggs brothers filling a pew with their best clothes and their sun-weathered faces, and Elias Ruiz, who had come up from San Antonio for the occasion, and a handful of neighbors who had watched this story unfold and were rooting for its ending with the particular investment of people who live near enough to each other that other people's lives become part of your own. Martha wore the blue dress she had saved from her youth, the one she had worn to her own parents' table on Sundays growing up in Missouri, repaired and altered until it fit the woman she was now, and she walked to the front of that church with her spine straight and her eyes clear, and the particular confidence of a woman who has chosen something with her whole self, not because she needed rescuing, not because the alternatives were foreclosure, not from the narrow desperation of having nowhere else to turn, but because she had looked at Joseph Crawford in every light and every season and every kind of difficulty, and she had found something worth trusting completely. He was already standing at the front of the church when she came down the aisle, and when he saw her his face did what faces do when the person arrives who carries all the investment of your heart. It opened and simplified, everything unnecessary dropping away until only the true thing remained. He looked at her the way she had been looked at in the moonlit wheat field, and not since then, as though she was the most significant fact in the available world. Reverend Blake made a service of it that was genuine and not overly long, and when Joseph Crawford said "I do," his voice was steady and full, and she felt it in her chest like a bell struck true. When she said "I do," Danny made a sound in the pew behind her that was either a cleared throat or a suppressed emotion, and she suspected, from the quality of the silence that followed, that it was the second thing. They celebrated at the Bell Farm because that was where everything had started and it was the right place for it. The yard was strung with lanterns, and the kitchen tables were brought outside, and people brought food in the way people do at these events. Bread and pies and smoked meats, and things preserved and fermented with considerable regional expertise. And Hector played the guitar with a skill and an expressiveness that silenced conversations mid-sentence, and made the evening into the kind of evening that becomes a story people tell their children about. Martha danced with Joseph Crawford on the grass behind the house while the lanterns swung in the spring breeze and the stars came out one by one overhead, and she thought about all the nights she had stood on this porch alone looking at his lamp 2 miles away and wondered what kind of man he was. She pressed her cheek against his shoulder and felt the solid warmth of him and thought, this kind. He was this kind. The following years built themselves with the particular satisfaction of a life that is actually working, not without difficulty, because difficulty is simply the weather of living on the land in Texas in the 1880s, but with the underlying solidity of two people who had found their footing together and kept it. Joseph Crawford's cattle and Martha Bell's wheat made the combined operation the most productive in the southeast corner of Colby County. Joseph kept his ranch house for storage and equipment, but he lived at the Bell Farm, and over the summer of 1883, they extended the main house with a large back room that became the study where they both kept accounts and papers, the lamp burning late many evenings while they sat across the table from each other with their work spread between them, and the particular comfortable silence of people who have learned each other's presence deeply. Danny Bell grew into himself through that year, and the next with the particular grace of a boy who has had the right kind of attention paid to him at the right time. He turned 15, 16, learned to manage cattle alongside the wheat operations, learned from Hector the Spanish that became useful in their dealings with the neighboring families, and eventually became something he carried with pride. He called Joseph Crawford by his given name, not father, and Crawford asked nothing else, because the word would have been given or not given in Danny's own time and in his own way, and some things you do not hurry. On a cold morning in February of 1884, Martha told Joseph that they were expecting a child. He was at the kitchen table when she told him, and he looked up from the accounts with the expression of a man hearing something he had hoped for but not let himself fully believe in, and the expression stayed on his face so openly and so completely that Martha felt a rush of love for him that was almost alarming in its force. "You are certain?" he asked. "My body is not in the habit of being uncertain about these things," she said. He stood up and came around the table and held her very carefully, the way you hold something you are afraid of hurting, and she put her hand on the back of his neck and said, "I'm not breakable, Joseph." And he held her more naturally then, both arms around her, his face in her hair. "I know you're not," he said, muffled. The pregnancy was a subject between them that held both great joy and a long shadow, because Martha had lost 2 children before and neither of them could entirely forget that. She did not let the shadow dominate, because she had decided long ago that she was not going to live her present life entirely inside the fear of losing it. But she and Joseph were honest with each other about the anxiety, which was its own kind of steadiness. The summer of 1884 was the hottest in 5 years. Martha worked as much as her growing body allowed and argued with Joseph about the limits of this, with the comfortable friction of 2 people who have learned to disagree without fracturing. He was protective in ways she sometimes found excessive and said so, and she was independent in ways he sometimes found alarming and said so, and they navigated it with the particular skill of people who have agreed that neither of them is going to win every argument and neither of them needs to. In September of 1884, on an evening when the heat had finally broken and the first real breath of fall was moving through the long grass, Martha Bell Crawford gave birth to a son. He was large and loud from the first moment, and he arrived with a decisiveness that the midwife Mrs. Callaghan declared professional. Joseph Crawford, who had been in the hall for 3 hours in a state of sustained and barely contained terror, was brought in and handed his son, and the expression on his face was something Martha watched from the exhausted warmth of the bed with a feeling so rich and complete that it had no single name. "He looks like Danny," Joseph said. "He looks like himself," Martha said. "Thomas?" Joseph asked, looking at her carefully, because he had thought about this, whether she would want to name a son for his predecessor, and had decided there was no right answer except the one she gave. Martha thought about Thomas Bell, who had planted 60 acres of wheat he never saw harvested, who had loved her imperfectly and worked hard and made a mistake that had led to everything that followed. She thought about his good jaw and his Bible and his pride and his fear. "Robert," she said. "Robert James Crawford." Joseph looked at her. "Robert was my grandfather," she said. "James was his father. Those are my people and he is my son and those names fit him." She paused. "Does that suit you?" "It suits me fine," Joseph said, looking back down at Robert James Crawford, who was applying himself to the business of existence with considerable vigor. The years moved forward with the momentum of a life that has found its true direction. In 1885, Harlan Decker made one final attempt to cause difficulty, this time through a county commissioner he had apparently purchased, who proposed a new water rights taxation structure that would have placed unreasonable burden on small farms with creek access. It was the kind of bureaucratic maneuvering that was harder to fight than a straightforward legal attack. Joseph Crawford organized a coalition of 8 neighboring ranches and farms, drew up a formal objection with Elias Ruiz, and presented it to the full county commission with a combined weight of signatures representing nearly 40% of the county's agricultural production. The proposed taxation structure was rejected. The purchased commissioner declined to run for re-election the following year. Harlan Decker began the slow contraction of a man whose methods have stopped working, and within 3 years he had sold most of his county holdings and relocated to somewhere in Oklahoma, and the county breathed more freely without him. Hector's family situation also found some resolution in these years. The Santiago property had been resold by Decker to a legitimate rancher, but Hector had saved carefully through his years at the Crawford operation, and Martha and Joseph helped him secure a small parcel of his own to the east of the Bell farm in 1886. And watching Hector walk his own land for the first time, running his hands along his own fence posts, was one of the things Martha kept in the category of the world being, occasionally and unexpectedly, fair. Danny Bell turned 18 in 1886 and began seriously managing the wheat operations with a capability that made Martha's heart catch with recognition, watching her son move through the east field with the same decisive understanding of the land that she had carried in her own hands for as long as she could remember. He was Thomas's son in the set of his shoulders and her son in the hardness and care of his thinking, and he was his own person in all the ways that mattered. He asked in the fall of that year if he could bring a young woman named Clara Hennessy to Sunday dinner. Clara was the daughter of a neighboring family, a girl of 19 with direct eyes and an opinion about everything and a laugh that started somewhere deep and arrived fully committed. Martha liked her immediately and without reservation. Joseph liked her because Danny liked her, and because she argued with Danny at the dinner table with the particular confidence of a person who is comfortable enough to disagree, and that was a good sign. Danny Bell and Clara Hennessy were married in the spring of 1887, in the same church where his mother and Joseph had been married 4 years before, and Martha sat in the front pew with Robert in her lap and Joseph's hand over hers, and watched her first son marry a woman who was going to give him exactly what he needed, which is to say a woman who would not let him get away with anything. In the summer of 1887, Martha found she was expecting again. This second pregnancy was easier in the physical sense and harder in the psychological sense because she was 36 years old, and she knew the actuarial weight of that, the way the risks shift with the years, and she carried the knowledge of it with the particular pragmatic honesty that was simply how she was built. Joseph did not pretend the concern away. He held it alongside her and found ways, small and constant, to make sure she knew she was not carrying anything alone. Their daughter was born in January of 1888, in a difficult and long labor that left Martha exhausted in a way she did not fully recover from for 2 months. But the daughter arrived healthy and furious about it, with a quality of presence so immediate that Mrs. Callaghan laughed at the first sound of her. They named her Clara, after no one in particular, because the name suited her from the first evening. By 1889, the Bell Crawford farm was the most productive wheat operation in that part of Colby County, with a cattle herd that complemented rather than competed with it, and a reputation that drew other farmers to ask advice about water rights and soil management, and the subtle art of surviving the intersection of ambition and adversity that was simply the fundamental condition of land in Texas. Martha was 38 years old, and she felt, for the first time in her adult life, something she might cautiously describe as settled. Not finished, because she was not a woman built for being finished, but settled in the way that a river settles into its proper course after finding its way through the terrain, still moving, still working, still completely itself, but moving in the right direction with the full confidence of its own momentum. She thought about this one evening in the summer of 1889, sitting on the back porch of the house that had expanded and grown around the bones of the original structure the way living things grow, with the new rooms adding themselves to the old ones in the natural way of a home that is genuinely inhabited. Robert was 5 years old and in bed. Baby Clara was not quite 2 and had been put down an hour ago with the diplomatic firmness required for a child that determined. Danny and his Clara were in their own house on the south end of the farm, the house that Martha and Joseph had helped them build the previous summer. Joseph came out and sat beside her with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one, and she took it, and they sat in the summer evening with the long grass moving out in the pasture and the stars present above the tree line to the east. "I was thinking about the day I rode past your fence," she said. "I know," he said. "You get that look." "What look?" she asked. "Like you are calculating something very large," he said. She smiled. I was calculating how different everything would be if Sable had not shied at that branch, she said. She did, though, he said. She did, Martha agreed. And you were standing at the fence. I had been standing at that fence for about 20 minutes before you rode past, he said. She turned to look at him. I saw you leave in the direction of Caldwell that morning, he said. I knew what day it was on the Decker loan because I had asked Pierce the week before. I did not know if you would pass on the way back, but I thought you might. He looked at his coffee cup with the slight expression of a man who has been caught being less accidental than he claimed. You were waiting for me, she said. I was standing at my own fence, he said, with careful precision and no real conviction. Martha Bell Crawford looked at her husband in the summer evening light and understood that she was looking at a man who had cared about her outcome long before she had known he was paying attention. A man who had positioned himself at a fence line on the chance that she would need something and he could offer it. A man who had spent the years since then showing up in every form and context that a person could show up, consistent and faithful and entirely present, asking nothing that she was not glad to give. Joseph Crawford, she said. Martha Bell, he said, and the use of her maiden name was so precisely exactly right that it made her laugh. She leaned against his shoulder in the summer dark, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the back porch of the Bell farm in the Texas evening, with the sound of the long grass in the small warm wind, and the lamp burning yellow in the kitchen behind them, and Robert asleep in his bed, with the flat comfortable oblivion of small children, and baby Clara's breathing audible through the open window, and Danny's lights visible on the south end of the property, and the east field where the new wheat was already 2 feet tall and climbing. The land was hers. She had kept it. Not just kept it, built it into something larger than it had been, and done it alongside a man who had come to her fence line on a June morning with his horses and his hands and his quiet, steady heart, and who had never once, in all the years that followed, made her feel that the debt was anything other than what he had said it was, which was nothing, nothing at all, which was to say the beginning of everything. The stars turned their slow wheel overhead. The wheat grew in the dark. The lamp burned in the kitchen. And Martha Bell rested against Joseph Crawford's shoulder and felt the particular, specific, hard-won contentment of a woman who has built her life with her own hands and the right person beside her, and who knows, down to the bedrock of herself, that it is good. Robert James Crawford came to them in the morning with his hair pointing in 3 directions, and a very important question about whether the spotted horse had eaten the apple he had left for her the evening before. And the day began again in the way that all good days begin, with the particular ordinary brightness of being exactly where you are supposed to be, with exactly the people you are supposed to be with, on the exact piece of land that is yours and theirs and real. Years later, when Robert was grown and Clara was fierce and beautiful and opinionated in ways that regularly delighted her father and tested her mother, and Danny's family had expanded to 3 children of his own who ran between the 2 houses with the territorial familiarity of children who do not recognize property lines as applying to them, Martha Bell Crawford would sometimes walk out to the east field in the early morning, before anyone else was up, and stand at the edge of it in the low summer light and listen. The wheat spoke its old language of wind and grain, the same language she had learned at 17 helping her father with the Missouri harvest, the language she had taught herself to understand in Texas soil and Texas weather, the language she had cut and bundled and loaded in 2 days of desperate work with a man she barely knew who had come to her fence without being asked, and given everything without keeping score. She would stand in the morning field and she would feel Thomas there, not as grief anymore, but as a kind of permanence, the way the dead become part of the soil of the places they worked. She would feel her lost children there too, the ones who had not had the chance to grow up on this land, and she would hold them in the way you hold something that will always be present precisely because it is absent, always a weight and always a gift. And then she would hear Joseph's boots on the path behind her, because he always knew where to find her, and she would turn and he would be coming through the morning with 2 cups of coffee the way he always did, and the day would open in front of them the way it always had, full of work and weather, and the endless negotiation between what you want and what the land will give. And she would take the cup from his hand and drink it standing in her wheat field and feel, from the soles of her feet to the crown of her head, the full and unambiguous privilege of this life. The farm endured, the love endured. And the woman who had one chance to save everything she had built stood in her east field in the summer mornings and knew, with the absolute certainty of someone who has looked that chance in the face and taken it with both hands, that she had been right to stop at the fence. She had been right about all of it.